Hey, welcome to my channel and welcome to my video. This is the second part in a series of exploring how I go about creating characters for my in-work field guide called the Ghostwoods. You can see here we've got our character here, and what we've done is we've already gone through the line work, scanning it in, inking it, and now we are in the process of doing what's called flatting, or laying in flats or flat colors. So this is a process by which you carefully select areas of the character. And this is a common thing in comics and other digital coloring. It's not a painterly style. It's more of a comic style or cartoon style, and you create careful selections and name them to populate your art with color. So each of these areas will have a distinct name. See that on the layers on the right. Probably not very readable with this thing, but they do have a distinct name, and they will have a specific color attached to them. Now, a lot of people will lay in flats using the lasso tool, um, the marquee tools, any combination of those. I've even from time to time done them by just simply coloring it in if my line work's thick enough with like a brush tool, like a thick brush and to 100% opacity with no softness. That will all work. I tend to rely on the tools I know the best. So in this case, it's the pen tool, and then not the lasso tool, not the freeform lasso, but the lasso where you point and click. And I find that those work the best for my style as well as my comfort level. I'd say my Photoshop is where I started and certainly is where my passion lies, but Illustrator's what I'm best at from in terms of character creation stuff. So the Ghostwoods is an attempt for me to really stretch my illustrative legs. That's sort of a medium I'm comfortable with, vector. Uh, I just don't feel like vector has the same character as these guys do. There's more charm in these guys. There's more homemade cookie in this recipe, and less factory marketing cookie. That's kind of a weird way to say it. But as you can see, I go about with the Bezier tool and the pen tool and are making selections based off of the curves that I see here and following lines pretty strictly. At this point, because I've already done any kind of cropping on the outside of the figure, I'm using the marquee. I'm using the pen tool to make really specific choices here, and I'm just trying to do it from a very basic standpoint. I picked a green color, Kermit green, and that's what I'm laying in for all the parts of the skin. It's not the final color, and I'm not too worried about it. I'm also not worried too much about color harmony at this point, right? All I'm trying to do is lay in a color, and that will allow me to use that layer. If you know this, you can click the thumbnail of any layer on the right side and press Command on the Mac, or Control, I believe, on the PC, and it will actually select every single pixel in that layer, meaning that selection essentially has been saved without you having to go to Save Selection and naming it that way. But also, with the right kind of selections, masking and parenting to that layer, you can paint freely on top of that color without worrying about going over, spilling into other cells. So flattening is a very important thing to do. It's important to get that just right, not over select over the line work, but not under select over the line work either, right? You don't want to leave. I always think you go right in the middle of the line work or you go all the way to the edge. You can always bring that line back a little bit, but it's important just to make a nice, clean selection. Be purposeful about your naming and where you put all those colors. And as I'm editing this, I'm realizing that my tenor of my voice is completely different than the last part of the series. I'm recording this at night, and I'm not trying to wake up everyone in my household while I'm screaming at a microphone on my desk. Anyways, so forgive the light ASMR reading, if you will. I'm sure everyone on the internet knows what that is. It's not my intent. Well, so as we can see here, I'm continuing to marquee these areas off, using the pen tool, and then making a selection based off of that. Now, I am selecting colors here and actually deciding a couple different ones, and that's because I believe this work is small enough that I can do that, but also effectively move through the flattening process and not lose too much time. Um, I know in some pieces I've done the colors and the flattening in bright orange, like the brightest colors, and the reason for that is because I want them to be apparent to me as the person who's working the file what is what, and that is a definitely unintentional color. I don't want to leave in a flatted color as like the one. The really cool thing about flattening is as you go further, it gets easier because what you're doing, you're starting with the largest areas and you're creating those layers first. And then when you make selection with the pen tool for, let's say, this shirt, if I accidentally select too much of the collar, the skin underneath the neckline here, or too much of the shoulder or the arm or the legs, I can simply hold Command and I believe Alt, and it will deselect that part of that selection away from the pen tool selection that I've made. You can see here I'm using that tool to effect because I don't want to have to think about where I put this. See, you can see here that I've got the selection. I'm kind of correcting some things in here. There's some bad selections in the pommel of that sword. Then I'm pressing Command and Alt, and you can see that I've made a really clean cut right at the neck. And if you look at this, with no line work on, there would be no gaps between those purple pixels and those green pixels, which is super important. And if you ever want to turn away from your line art and move to a more painterly style, that's something to think about. So it allows you to be sloppy in certain areas of the illustration as you get further through this process and move quicker, right? You don't have to be so specific with your selections. Now, again, this guy is simple enough and has small enough parts to separate that I don't have to worry too much about that. I can kind of take my time and make these selections with the exception of just one or two places. Like you can see here again, I'm doing it at the head. And look, I've got the color selected already. And I'm just going to pick a nice dark green color. And I'm going to apply that. I do apologize for the artifacting on the recording. It's funny because I'm just using screen recording through Mac's inbuilt screen recording, which is through QuickTime, and it records at like near 59 frames per second. So you'd think that's high quality, but ultimately it is not. And it's unfortunate that I'm not, there's a lot of smearing and artifacting going on as I move the camera. So we can hope that isn't too distracting on the final view, but I have a feeling it's not something we can do about now. As we continue through the character, I want to point out a few things in my design process for the character. Like as we said in the previous version, this is kind of a loose, like Kermit the Frog homage. The Muppets, like I think a lot of people my age, were a big part of when I grew up, and so it's when I was thinking about characters that could encounter the author of the field guide, my thought turned to, okay, if we've got forests, but what other biomes can we place in the forest? Is there a swampy area? Is there a river? There's mountains. All sorts of things can happen in this larger area known as the Ghostwood. And so one of my thoughts was let's have that swamp area, and of course then your mind goes to frogs, and it drew a lot of frogs, did a little research, and it dawns on me that the classic, almost every video game or art thing that I've ever seen is almost in some way has to relate back to like Kermit, because he's such a perfect example of what we recognize as a frog in pop culture. And so what better creature to kind of start with as your build for this character? So I've done a couple things, give him heavily lidded eyes. He certainly doesn't have a look that Kermit would have, but almost like I'm kind of referencing that meme, like the drinking the tea meme. I'm not doing the slits in the eyes like Kermit has, and this frog is wearing clothes and is not playing a banjo, and I don't think has a pig girlfriend. Maybe he does. I'm not sure. I haven't created any pig animals to be part of the Ghostwoods yet, so we'll see. Now I'm going to continue with the smaller sections here. And one thing that I try to keep in mind as I'm working on flats is that I almost construct them in the way that the clothes might be worn. So, for example, the clothing goes above the skin layer, and then the buttons of the clothing go above that layer, and other props go above that layer until we're at the smallest of the details, like the color of the eye, the pupil maybe, um, the blade of the dagger, the buttons on the shirt. Um, what I find too is that as you continue through this, it may not make a lot of sense to, for example, in the shirt we're looking at here, the buttons are actually colored purple right now, but they're not going to be purple in the final drawing. They're going to be whatever color they end up being. But since they're such a small detail, I'm going to go ahead and leave them purple. Now, I think if you watch the first section, you'll also remember I had some problems with this pattern, not really reading right. Its placement in the illustration also, and I figured this out here later, is it's also reading, the colors are above where they should be on the cape. So one thing you need to do is keep in mind you have to steal the layer mask for this layer from the line work and copy it over to the color work for it to really work. Now what you can also do is deselect other areas to mark out, but in this case I haven't done the belt, for example, so we're getting some see-through on the belt, which we would eventually cover up with something else. The problem you might run into where you have these overlapping colors and you say, oh, I'm going to cover that up anyways. That's all fine and good unless, for example, you start using an overlay layer or some kind of layer style, opacity style, to add an effect to your work. Whereas, okay, well, I'm going to use the purple on the jacket, maybe I want it as an overlay or multiply, and then you end up creating the unintended effect of it multiplying or somehow interacting with the green of the skin, for example, if it was underneath. And then as I continue on, again, like we're getting to smaller and smaller pieces, and you can see here with the belt how I'm really going to get helped out by the fact that the shirt's already done. So I can do a little bit of work here at the edges where we're intersecting with other undone areas, but then I can just simply Command Alt select all the other layers to eliminate any unwanted coloring of the pixels. And that's actually much quicker than the alternative, which is going all the way around the belt with maybe, like we're seeing here, the pen tool or the lasso tool, and instead just simply making a few selections and doing some slight cutouts. It certainly feels like it saves you a lot of time as you're saving so many clicks with the tools that we have here. And that's the thing to keep in mind. The lasso tool is very click sensitive in that you can double click very easily with the lasso tool, especially when you're starting out using it, and literally it'll double select everything, and there's not a lot you can do to get back to where you were. Uh, the pen tool, however, doesn't do that. The pen tool doesn't have a double click to finish that I'm aware of. It might, but I've also broken myself from that overly fast clicking habit. You really do have to build a muscle memory for using that lasso tool to do this kind of selection of flats. And as well as you can see here is make sure that you're on the right layer before you start coloring things in, because it's very easy to color on the wrong layer, and then that color is kind of stuck there, and especially if it's next to another color, it's going to be harder to lift off than just redoing the selection and redoing the color. Here's kind of a tricky one. We have these little hairs that are poking out of the frog. The frog's name is Colin, by the way. The frog's haircut. So depending on what kind of style you're doing here, you could either capture those selections or you could leave those empty and they can just be little black tick marks. One thing to keep in mind though, as I mentioned in my last portion, is that I am going to do a white outline on the frog character so that he stands out from the background. Now that may not make it into the final illustration, but if I'm using this for any like splash art or sharing it with Instagram, I'm going to want that white line to hit almost every single edge of Colin's line work. And so you'll need some kind of color in the background of the image so that you can expand that selection to create that white outline. You'll see when we get to that later. So even if that line, for example, like this eyelash is a great example, even if that eyelash doesn't have a background color because it's going to be black, you may want to create a layer to have some pixels on it to hold for that eyelash so that if in the future you do want to change the color or you need to apply effect to it or you need it to be cut out, you can do so with ease. This really is about file organization and not so much about what is the right color for each of the different spots or the skin or any of that stuff. But we're gonna stay pretty close to this color when we finish, and that's just because, quite frankly, the colors are pretty close to what we expect out of a frog, and green and purple is a pretty powerful color combination, especially when you start including the browns, which kind of speak to the orange family. And we create a really powerful triptych there of colors. And I think it's important to kind of point out here too, is this work really is the pre-work before you like this illustration. I find that if I like it at this point, that I won't like it at the end. And if I don't like it at this point, but if I power through the completion of the image, get all the flats laid, and start to lay in colors and create color harmonies and start working with layer styles, opacity styles, and overlay effects, textures, and other things, I can actually start to get a composition that I like and that works. Whereas I may not find that to be the case with the image normally. I may find that this green and purple doesn't work together, and I really want to stop working on this because I'm kind of disheartened by the contrast or whatever. You can kind of help yourself there too by, as you can see here in my libraries panel, I've built in a bunch of color libraries from the Cooler app and other places. And this follows me through my Illustrator work as well as my Photoshop work, and essentially gives me some color harmonies to work with if I wanted to just create like a simple green to blue harmony. If I wanted to do all super saturated colors, if I was looking for like a very swampy type character. And I find that that's actually been a powerful shortcut for my work because I'm not looking to create these colors and kind of coming up with some ugly orange or something like that. I've got a color, and then I've got colors that I know will work next to it because I can all see them in a row versus selecting them blind from the color picker. Um, having some kind of artist palette in mind. Now, I think one of the things that some artists, and myself included, have had and this is something you kind of have to fight, is that that's cheating though. Like you should come up with your own color palettes. Well, trust me, I do. I have them in there as well. But the colors are not owned by anyone. They're not copyrighted, and well, with the exception of some colors. But what I mean is the color combinations they have there have been shared freely with the community for a reason. And most artists will have something in mind when they're thinking of a piece anyways. Like, oh, I know I really want to use pink in this piece, or I really want to use a magenta in this piece, or I'm thinking of making this a lot of yellow and black. So having some kind of template to work from is powerful and necessary sometimes. Well, I'm going to go ahead and let the video play out here a little bit and come back after the jump to talk to you a little bit about the final processes here before we move on to part 3, which is final color selection and shading. Now, I think the final piece is probably going to have highlights as well, but I want to make sure that I've created all the props, environments, buildings, other characters that I want in the piece before I go about going and adding really specific color combinations and getting ahead of myself. Um, I'll have this laid out all in an InDesign document and be able to see the entire page layout at one time and how the colors interact and are they clashing, do they work with other characters on the map, that kind of thing. And what I really want to do there is make sure that I leave myself room to work on this project and don't hone it to the point where it's so perfect within itself that it can't interact with anything else. And there's like a lot of really useful tools you can talk about using that, like color balance tools, but it might be just easier just to kind of leave in some basics and then get to a point later where you kind of take all the various characters, props, and environments and marry them in a way that makes sense for the overall piece what this will be placed in. All right, see y'all in a minute. Okay. Well, we're back. So now what we're doing is we're trying to get to the point where we can share this online. Like, hey, the flats are laid in. I'm ready to maybe start working on this piece. So we're getting to the point where we can share it online. You can see here is what we're doing is we're taking the selection of the entire character, and we've using the selection of you're just pressing Command, clicking on every layer, and then pressing Expand, and then filling that with white. But we have some areas that never had a selection made for them, right? So the eyelashes, for example, the stalks of the cattails, the flies and the fly buzz. I'm probably going to leave those off because I don't want them to have anything. But all of those things now need a outline in order to achieve the effect we're looking for. The top of the cattails have an outline because they have color, but the stalks don't. And that's kind of silly if you think about it, that they aren't. So we're going to connect these with some basic shapes that we're going to make here, make a selection, and fill them in with our white foreground color. And the same thing for the other stalk next to it. So it's a basic maneuver, but one that needs to get done in order to kind of pull off this outline look. And again, this is very cartoony, very much like in the modality of what I do in Illustrator. But I find it powerful, especially with this simplified look, for making things stand out and really making this approachable, easy on the eyes, and also just it's an effect I like, to be quite frank, right? And it shouldn't take that much longer to get this done. And what it does is that you can make this character stand in the background, and all of this stuff lives on its own layer. This whole white outline is not something that we have to manage. We can just turn it off if we feel like it's not working for us. And whereas we might do the little bit of horizon line coming off the plant, maybe we won't do the texture lines that are coming off of the bottom of the things. And that's really just more like, hey, does that serve the aesthetic we're going for? It's your drawing, you do what you want, right? It may be something I go back to and do it, but I think this works. Now, I know one thing that I noticed when I went through this is that it's all very jagged in places. That's because we used the lasso tool to make this. What we're doing here is we're going to go ahead and tweak our selection. We're going to shrink it and then smooth it a little bit. And then we're going to flip the selection and delete what we don't like out of the smoothed area. You can see here our flats are pretty well good and done. So before we move on to part 3, where we do our final colors and our shading, and other special effects, what I'd like to do is thank you for watching part 2. If you liked it, please give me a like, and if you disliked it, feel free to dislike it, or give me a comment on what else you'd like to see. If you think that you learned something and that you'd like to learn more about illustration or anything related to topics, or I just entertain you, I'd be honored to have your subscription. You can find all of my various social media links in the description. And until next time, or part 3, thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you later.